The forward staging tent exhaled cold evening air, its canvas rippling softly as lantern glow wavered over a folding table cluttered with map sheets. A knot of SEAL operators hovered above the terrain models, their talk easy, confident, almost bored. One of them snorted that the attached sniper was probably better at hauling binoculars than firing rounds, and another tossed out a joke about headquarters needing to check a diversity box, so they dragged her along. Lieutenant Lena Cade stood a few steps behind them, small frame still, posture quiet, gaze lowered, not welcomed into a single tactical exchange. Someone gestured vaguely toward the perimeter without even turning and muttered, "Just stick to rear overwatch and stay in your lane." She clasped her hands together, and a thin scar on her wrist caught the lantern light. One of the men noticed, hesitated for a breath, then dismissed it like it meant nothing at all. None of them realized the only reason they'd still be breathing after sunrise was standing silently right behind them. Before we get started, subscribe to Major Tom's Tales and let us know where you're tuning in from. Lieutenant Lena Cade was 26, yet she already carried the look of someone who had lived in harsh places longer than most people lived in comfort. She grew up in Ravenport, where winter acted less like a season and more like a permanent houseguest. Her earliest memories were of ocean wind slicing through layers of jackets, and her grandfather's steady hand turning her toward the mountains instead of the docks. Elias Cade, once a mountain rescue medic, taught her early that terrain punished the careless and rewarded those who moved with patience. Before she was 10, he led her up loose shale ridges, showing her how rock behaved, crumbling under force but staying true if you listened with your feet. While other kids stayed near town, Lena learned how to cross unstable ground without sending a single pebble rolling. When she told her grandfather she planned to serve, he didn't argue. He simply nodded and reminded her that bravery wasn't sewn into a uniform, it was shaped by choices. She enlisted and disappeared into the long gray corridors of basic training. As Ravenport slowly faded into something like a postcard in her mind, she kept drifting toward maps, range cards, and the high elevation spots no one else wanted to touch. It wasn't loud talent that made her stand out. It was steady precision, and that strange ease she had with heights that unsettled people who preferred the ground. During a joint exercise, while others gasped in thin air and slipped on crumbling ledges, Lena moved as if she were back on the cliffs of her childhood. A special operations evaluator watched her climb, watched her shoot, and without fanfare pushed her toward an advanced sniper observer track. The closer Lena moved toward the elite circles, the more she seemed to fade into the background. People preferred loud confidence filling a room, not quiet precision standing off to the side of a map board. The sharper she grew at reading terrain, the easier it became for others to treat her like part of the scenery. Some of it came down to her voice. Lena spoke softly, never pushing herself into conversations, never battling for space with volume. She rarely challenged decisions in front of others, even when she privately doubted a chosen route or timing. She didn't win attention with stories or humor, and her slight build convinced most she belonged behind a keyboard rather than a rifle. In a culture where noise often masqueraded as competence, she was effortless to underestimate. People saw the tidy bun, the calm demeanor, the steady gaze, and assumed that was all she was. They never saw the girl who once hung off Winter Rock with numb fingers because retreating meant abandoning someone who needed her. All they noticed was someone who never raised her voice. At the forward base chow hall, the judgment usually began before she even sat down. One evening, just before the Valley mission, 2 SEALs traded opinions loudly enough for her to hear. One jabbed at his food and wondered if she had actually qualified as a sharpshooter, or if someone had just pushed her paperwork through. The other laughed that her gloves looked untouched, like fresh gear pulled straight from the package. Lena heard everything, but her expression stayed neutral. She placed her tray down, shoulders loose, breathing measured the way she did when settling behind a scope. Instead of responding, she pulled a laminated terrain overlay from her pocket, a topographical slice of the mountains they'd soon step into. While others ate and swapped stories, she studied contour lines and elevations, tracing ridges and ravines as if they were the only voices that mattered. She ran the planned route again and again, quietly checking how wind would slide through each saddle and how sound might bounce off stone walls. The chatter at the other table lost significance, even if it didn't lose volume. Later that night, Captain Damon Rusk spotted her at the operations tent, standing by the map board. Clipboard in hand, grease pencil worn to the nub, he focused on the main assault element. Without fully turning toward her, he dragged a finger along the route, assigning call signs and roles. When he reached her name, his tone stayed flat, though his interest clearly dipped. "Cade, you'll anchor the backside," he said, marking a small point near a ridge. "Rear observation only. No direct engagement unless ordered. Just relay movement and maintain accurate tracking." To him, it was the safest place to stash someone he considered untested, far enough from the main push that she couldn't interfere with anything that mattered. She nodded without comment, offering no resistance to the distance placed between her and the action. When he walked away, she stayed in front of the map, committing every contour of her assigned sector to memory. If they intended to put her on the outer edge of the fight, she would make sure she understood that edge down to the last line before any of them set foot on rock. When Lena finally found herself alone, her quiet rituals slipped into place. In a small notebook with corners already softened from use, she wrote key grid coordinates from memory, closed it, then repeated the process until the numbers flowed without hesitation. She traced contour lines on copied maps with her fingertip, murmuring distances, elevations, and wind routes the way someone else might hum familiar lyrics. Repetition wasn't punishment for her, it was armor. In still moments she would pause and touch the silver medallion tucked beneath her shirt, the one hanging from a thin worn chain. The edges had been smoothed by years of her thumb, brushing over the intertwined letters J and K. She never explained the charm, and no one ever pressed hard enough to ask twice. To outsiders, it probably looked like a nervous fidget, another sign of someone unsure of herself. Inside, it was a tether to something she refused to let fade. Whatever the others assumed, whatever rank dictated about assignments, Lena knew exactly why she lived the way she did. Why cold ridges and steep cliffs and contour maps felt more honest than half the conversations she heard. And honestly, what would you have done standing in her place? Speak up, demand respect, call out every careless joke, or stay quiet the way she did and let your work speak louder than anything you could say. The night kicked off with the deep pulse of rotor blades and the sharp scent of aviation fuel clinging to winter air. 2 CH-47s pushed into the mountain range, their hulking shapes swallowed by black sky and jagged ridge lines. Inside the dim cargo bay, red lighting washed over straps, helmets, and the seasoned calm of men who had flown missions like this countless times. Lena sat near the rear ramp, boots planted, fingers loosely hooked into the webbing at her side. The vibration of the aircraft hummed through her spine and carried her into the part of her mind where maps overlapped with memory. She could almost feel the terrain beneath them, the valleys channeling icy wind, the ravines cutting the earth into narrow, echoing slots. Across from her, Major Aaron Vance studied a folded map for what had to be the 6th time, though he already knew every step in the plan. He was the sort of leader people trusted instinctively, a man whose voice stayed steady even when everything else tilted sideways. The SEALs around him shot quick glances his way, watching his posture more closely than the cabin's glowing status lights. Captain Damon Rusk made his way down the line, tapping shoulders, checking straps, reinforcing the plan in crisp, efficient bursts. His tone lived somewhere between professional and mildly impatient, as though everything had been settled hours ago and only minor reminders remained. When his eyes passed over Lena, they barely paused, as if her presence required no attention at all. Outside the open ramp, the world blurred past in streaks of shadow. Frozen ravines carved violent scars through the land, pushing wind into slicing gusts. Snow-dusted choke points sat like jagged teeth between dark peaks, waiting for anyone, bold or unlucky, enough to pass through. Lena tracked what little she could see, reading the outlines of the land even in near darkness. She knew how sound twisted down there, bouncing unpredictably until distance became guesswork. She knew that once they landed, false echoes could hide real threats. The pilots announced altitude and approach with calm voices over the intercom. The insertion point drew close. Just another mark on the overlay to most of the team, but tomorrow it would be a place where contour lines squeezed too tight, where natural terrain and human planning pressed uncomfortably together. The Chinooks flared and settled in blasts of dust and wind. Cold air knifed into the cargo bay as the ramp lowered, scraping lungs with the bite of high elevation. The SEAL platoon pushed out with disciplined urgency, spreading through the darkness like ink flowing into cracks. Lena followed with her small recon element, her boots crunching softly through the crusted frost. Above them, the helicopters clawed back into the night and vanished, leaving only fading rotor echoes and the thin hiss of mountain wind behind. The darkness seemed to expand once the engines were gone, the silence settling in heavier and far more honest. The team moved along a narrow trail carved into the ridge, their shadows stretching in a single file against the rock. On one side, the slope fell away into a black void where one misplaced step meant a long, unforgiving drop. On the other, jagged stone pressed close enough to scrape a rifle barrel if anyone drifted too far. Major Aaron Vance led the main element, his silhouette steady, rifle lowered but ready, moving with the calm certainty of someone who trusted both his map and the men behind him. The SEALs followed in staggered positions, sweeping their arcs and believing in the plan that had brought them into this cold, hostile valley. Lena stayed in her assigned slot, slightly to the rear and a bit off to the side, a place that let her observe without stepping on anyone's authority. Her eyes tracked not just the path but the ridgelines above. She caught faint shapes near the crest, maybe shadows, maybe something else. She slowed for half a beat, lifting her gaze. The movement didn't behave like drifting rock or shifting cloud. It repeated with an unsettling rhythm, small silhouettes rising and vanishing along the ridge at near-perfect intervals. Nature didn't breathe in patterns like that. She listened to their own footsteps, the crunch and scrape, and then to the quiet moments between each step. In those thin gaps, she picked up the faintest echo of someone, or several someones, adjusting positions above them, like boots testing footholds, like weapons being settled into place. She felt the pattern more than heard it, a quiet wrongness woven into the dark. Lena halted completely, making the man behind her stumble for a moment. She spoke softly into her radio, voice nearly lost in the mountain wind. Movement repeating along the ridge. Crest pattern isn't natural. Ahead, Captain Damon Rusk stiffened but didn't stop walking. He didn't even glance back. His reply snapped over the net, clipped and irritated. "Cade, report confirmed figures only. No speculation. Stay in your lane." Two SEALs close enough to overhear traded looks in the dark. Faces hidden, reactions obvious. One gave a quiet scoff. heavy with judgment. The other let out a short laugh, the kind that said this matched exactly what they'd assumed about the quiet attachment. Lena exhaled slowly and kept moving, folding her observations into the same place she tucked every early warning no one wanted to hear. Still, the ridge above gnawed at her, the way those shapes seemed to shift together like they shared a single breath. The trail widened as they neared the basin by the village, the ground flattening into a shallow bowl surrounded by higher rock. What had looked open from a distance now felt tight and confined, like the base of a stone throat. The air turned colder, unnaturally still, and even the sound of their footsteps didn't scatter. It just settled, trapped between the rising walls. Up ahead, faint outlines of the village structures sat quiet against the sky, almost peaceful. The stillness twisted in Lena's gut. It felt too perfect, too arranged, the sort of quiet that had intent behind it. She checked the time, replaying the map stored in her memory, and couldn't shake the sense that they were standing exactly where someone wanted them. Then, without warning, because real disaster rarely announces itself, the world shifted. One moment, the valley held nothing but their breaths and the soft rustle of gear. The next moment, the sky above them tore open. Mortars crashed down with ruthless precision. Not wild shots, but deliberate impacts falling in a perfect grid. The first blast slammed into the formation's right flank, throwing dirt and shards of shattered rock across the men. A second explosion hammered the center, launching a soldier off his feet and rolling a curtain of dust through the basin. Then machine guns erupted from at least 3 high angles, each one positioned to rake the valley floor. Tracer rounds slashed glowing lines through the darkness, crossing and weaving like someone had etched kill lanes onto invisible glass. Bullets shredded stone around them, ricochets sparking bright flashes that filled the depression with stinging fragments and choking grit. Lena dropped instinctively, pressing into a shallow dip just as rounds chewed apart the spot where she had been standing seconds earlier. The air shook with the deafening mix of belt-fed guns thundering and smaller rifles cracking, voices shouting in English, and another language all tangled with the violence of impact. Radios that had worked flawlessly minutes ago now spat static or stayed completely dead. Men screamed into handsets for air support or higher command and got nothing but silence back. Comms were gone, smothered by jamming equipment hidden somewhere above. Strobe markers, meant to cut through chaos, flickered weakly or failed altogether. The tools that were supposed to separate friend from foe, the signals that guided aircraft to safe landing zones, were useless in gloved hands. Everything that felt guaranteed at the base evaporated like breath in freezing wind. Their extraction window, the unspoken promise that helicopters would return if things collapsed, slammed shut. There was no quick exit, no easy shift to a backup plan. The valley had become a locked chamber, and the enemy held every latch. Major Aaron Vance pushed forward to reposition his men, shouting instructions that barely cut through the noise. He pointed toward a scrap of cover near the left wall, trying to pull his most exposed shooters out of the worst of it. As he turned, shrapnel from a near hit carved into his shoulder near the collarbone, spinning him to the ground. 2 SEALs grabbed him and dragged him behind a twisted outcrop that provided the thinnest shield from the storm of fire. His jaw clenched against the pain, but his eyes still tracked the angles overhead, trying to make sense of where the deadliest arcs were forming. Corporal Tessa Wynne, the medic, sprinted across a stretch of ground that felt impossibly long under fire. She slid beside a man whose leg was nearly split open by a fragment, blood pulsing out in frightening surges. Without hesitation, she clamped gauze in both hands on the wound as rounds sparked off rock inches from her boots. Around them, chaos threatened to swallow every trace of order. Some men returned fire in controlled bursts, trying to catch glimpses of shooters who vanished as fast as they appeared. Others stayed flattened to the earth, waiting for orders that couldn't break through the noise or for a chance to move that never came. Lena pressed deeper into the rocky depression, heart hammering, ears ringing. She forced her breath to slow. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. The same rhythm she'd learned to fight off panic years ago. Even through the thunder of weapons, she recognized the pattern she'd sensed earlier. Now, it wasn't subtle. Every burst from above came from angles chosen to overlap fields of fire. Mortars stepped their impacts like someone following coordinates on a preset chart. None of this was random. None of it was opportunistic. This was architecture. She tried her radio again, voice steady even as dust rained onto her helmet. Only fractured static answered her, thin and broken, like distant voices drowning far beneath water. They were trapped inside the valley now, every line to the outside world severed. And this is where loud confidence folds in on itself, where practiced swagger finally meets reality and goes quiet, where voices that once dominated rooms crack around the edges. In moments like this, the only thing that matters is the quiet choice someone makes far from the spotlight. In the shadows, where silence becomes a battlefield of its own, Lena pressed the side of her radio again, adjusting the dial by a fraction as if accuracy alone might cut through the noise. The signal hissed, flickered, then vanished into static. She cycled through another frequency, then another, keeping her tone even and steady. Nothing opened. The silence felt intentional, like someone had built a wall between them and the rest of the world. It was the kind of silence that made people freeze, waiting for orders that were never coming. She crouched lower, elbows against the cold dirt, scanning the valley's jagged shapes. The ridgeline above still twisted her stomach. Too many blind angles, too many shadows hiding perfectly timed bursts of fire. Her gaze fixed on a rough structure along a distant rise, marked on earlier maps as Formation 12 Delta. Those printed words flashed through her mind, non-traversable, notations that almost never lied. Yet the slope looked less impossible now, and more simply misunderstood. She whispered into the dark, barely parting her lips. That mapping is wrong. No one was close enough to hear, or maybe no one cared to. The fighting hadn't really stopped, but it had lulled just long enough for both sides to shift positions, the kind of pause that always precedes something worse. She pulled her pack toward her and unbuckled the top flap. Every movement was intentional. She removed the medical kit, weighing its value, then set it aside. Extra layers, tools, attachments. She stripped out anything that would slow the climb she was already committing to. She exhaled once, steady and final, and kept only what her body could carry under strain. A tightly coiled rope, a chalk pouch she hadn't touched since training, 14 spare rounds wrapped in cloth to press against her ribs, a single water flask, and her rifle. When she sealed the pack again, it weighed less than half what it had minutes earlier, lean enough to cling to her back without shifting. She looked up at the rock face, tracing angles where the slope broke into ledges barely wide enough for a foot. Behind her, someone noticed the gear movement and stepped closer. It was Corporal Finn Darrow, his uniform streaked with dust and blood that wasn't his. He narrowed his eyes at the stripped-down kit. "What are you doing?" he asked, disbelief creeping in. She tightened her shoulder strap and answered without drama, without intent to explain further. "Fixing elevation." Her tone was flat enough that he assumed she meant optics adjustment. He gave a hesitant nod, uncertain if he should press, then hurried back toward the wounded, calling his name. The ridge cast a deeper shadow over her as she moved forward. Dust puffed around her boots, settling briefly before disappearing in the wind. Her steps were nearly soundless, not because she sought stealth, but because climbing like this lived in her bones long before war made it tactical. She slipped past clusters of men crouched behind broken rock. None spoke to her, and a few barely registered she was leaving what little safety they had. She angled toward the base of Formation 12 Delta, weaving behind debris to avoid the arcs of fire still sweeping the far slope. Enemy voices drifted faintly, bouncing off stone and returning in warped echoes, though none were close enough to matter. The wind cut through the valley, thin and cold, brushing grit across her cheek. It tasted like early winter, a sharp reminder of Ravenport, and of what climbing used to mean before it became survival. Reaching the lower ledge, she pressed her palm to the rock, feeling the faint cold pulse beneath the surface. Even stone felt alive if you held it long enough. She set her foot into a narrow hold, leaned upward, and began her ascent. Each motion deliberate, nothing excessive, nothing her body couldn't absorb. Behind her, tracers ripped across the sky as the fighting resumed, painting angled streaks of light while voices rose again in shouts. Someone shouted for suppressive fire. Someone else cried out for a medic. Yet the higher Lena climbed, the more those sounds thinned out, as if altitude itself was swallowing them. If anyone had looked up, they might have seen a lone silhouette scaling a slope the maps had declared impossible. But no one looked. Their world was the valley, the immediate danger. Hers reached upward, where the only route left demanded that gravity release its grip inch by inch. She wedged her fingers into a narrow crack and hauled herself higher, leaving behind everything familiar. Darkness swallowed her shape, thin air stealing her breath, but silence stayed with her, not as weakness or retreat, but as focused movement, deliberate step after deliberate step, toward the one place where the battlefield shifted. Wind slammed against the cliff the moment Lena pulled onto the first narrow rise, slicing sideways instead of down, threatening to peel her from the rock like loose paper. She pressed her chest flat against the cold stone until the gust passed, then searched for the next hold. Her gloves scraped across sandstone, feeling it shift from gritty to fragile, tiny fragments breaking under her touch and tumbling into the dark below. She shifted her weight carefully, testing every angle before committing, muscles burning from cold and tension. Her boots found a sliver of a ledge, barely wide enough to hold half her soul. She balanced there, knees bent to absorb the tremors. Not fear yet, just early exhaustion. Her arms began to shake in small, familiar pulses she hadn't felt since climbing in the mountains of Ravenport. She paused long enough for one slow breath through her nose, steadying her heartbeat. The rock held, so she moved again. Another burst of wind pushed at her side. She flattened herself tighter to the wall, ribs pressed into jagged ridges, face turned to keep sand from her eyes. The night felt sharper at this height, each breath thinner. She shifted her fingers along a narrow vertical seam until she found a shallow groove. Her thumb brushed instinctively against the silver medallion beneath her shirt, those worn letters, J and K, before she moved again. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, soft but certain. Trust angles, not surfaces. Rock is honest. He'd told her that when she hung from an icy cliff at 13, boots slipping, hands going numb. He hadn't pulled her up. He'd waited for her to choose whether she trusted herself enough to climb. That lesson had carved itself deep long before she left home, long before she left any version of a normal life behind. Clinging now to a slope most people wouldn't approach even in daylight, she felt that truth again. The rock wouldn't lie. It wouldn't pretend to hold her. Every grip either supported or gave way. Her job was simply to read it right. She climbed another body length, fingers digging into rough stone until thin slices of sandstone cracked through her gloves. The sting hit instantly, warm cuts opening across her knuckles, dust mixed with blood, making her grip slick until she adjusted and found cleaner stone. Pain didn't distract her. It refined her focus. Halfway up, as she shifted onto a foothold that seemed stable, the entire piece snapped free. For a terrifying heartbeat, the world tilted backward. Her stomach lurched, arms flared out, boots scraping helplessly against smooth rock. Gravity yanked at her, a sudden brutal pull. Her shoulders slammed the wall, knocking air from her lungs, but two fingers snagged a tiny protrusion before she fell outright. The hold nearly ripped loose. She hung suspended, chest tight, breath shallow and hot against the freezing air. Panic clawed at her throat, but she drove it down the way she'd learned decades ago. She stayed still, one breath, another. When her mind caught up to her body, she pulled herself slowly back toward the wall, inch by inch, until weight settled into her legs again. Her hands shook, but not enough to stop her. She leaned her forehead against the cold stone, grounding herself in its steadiness. Far below, faint muzzle flashes blinked across the valley. From her vantage, the pinned seals looked small, almost shapeless figures swallowed by terrain built to destroy them. Each flash revealed quick silhouettes, men crouched behind shattered rock, some hauling the wounded, others firing blindly toward ridgelines they could barely make out. The valley pulsed with bursts of explosive light, then vanished into darkness again just as fast. Lena swallowed hard. That alone was enough reason to keep moving. She pushed upward, ignoring the raw burn in her fingers. Every few meters, she tested each hold with the edge of her boot before trusting her weight to it. Her arms felt heavier, muscles burning in a deep, quiet way that warned her limits were closing in. She shifted her hips, braced a shoulder, and wedged herself into a narrow crease before climbing again. Wind ripped across the upper walls, flinging grit against her face and lodging dust in her collar. She blinked through it and kept going. Her gloves tore open at the fingertips, exposing skin that scraped raw against sharp stone. Her forearms seared with a pulse of pain every time she pulled upward. Her legs trembled under the constant balancing act, each angle demanding focus. Still, she climbed. Near the top, the slope steepened sharply, forcing her to cling with both hands and drive her boots sideways into cracks barely wide enough to hold. Her lungs worked in short, thin bursts, altitude and exertion squeezing every breath. She felt her heartbeat throbbing inside the cuts across her fingertips. Her chest scraped the ridge edge as she dragged herself over the lip with the last of her strength. She collapsed, flat on top, arms sprawled, cheek pressed to cold stone. She stayed there for several long seconds, letting shock drain from her limbs, letting muscles uncoil from the climb that nearly took her life. Blood streaked her palms, mixing with dust, turning her hands a darker shade. Her legs buzzed with numbness from the repeated strain, and her shoulders pulsed with aches that promised bruises if tomorrow ever came. Lena rolled to her side and forced herself to crawl toward the edge. Her breathing hitched and stuttered, but she dragged herself forward until the entire valley unfolded beneath her. What she saw tore the breath she had left from her chest. The battlefield spread out like a training simulation, but sharper, cleaner. She could see everything not as chaos but as deliberate design. Enemy fighters arranged in overlapping fire arcs, choke points controlling every avenue of movement, ammunition caches tucked into blind ridges, mortar teams adjusting elevation, machine gunners sweeping predictable kill lanes, commanders signaling from elevated perches. From this height, the truth was unmistakable. The valley wasn't a battleground at all. It was a trap built with patient cruelty and exact precision. Her hand drifted to the silver medallion beneath her shirt, the initials J.K. cold against her fingers. Jonah Cade, her brother, Staff Sergeant Jonah Cade, who died rescuing others from a ledge not so different from the one she had just climbed. He had been the reason she learned cliffs in the first place, the reason she never left anyone in the dark. And he was the reason that letting the men below die was simply not an option. Not morally, not emotionally, not in any version of reality she could live with. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling that familiar ache tug at her chest, then opened them again and stared down at the valley. "When life breaks once," the narrator whispered, "you either harden or you walk away." She chose neither. She climbed. Lena settled behind her rifle, pressing the stock into bruised muscle, steadying her breath into silence. Below her, the valley stretched out like a map she could reach out and trace. Enemy positions lit up in her memory exactly where she had studied them hours earlier. Lena aligned her first shot, letting her gaze skim the ridge where a hostile sniper had been punishing the men below with slow, methodical fire. She calculated distance, drift, angle, one steady breath, and squeezed the trigger. The round sliced through the cold air and landed before anyone even processed the sound. The sniper's head jerked forward, his body collapsing in the same instant. One shadow gone, one threat erased. Below, the SEALs hesitated mid-exchange, startled by a shift they couldn't explain. Incoming fire weakened. Someone ducked late, expecting rounds that never arrived. Lena shifted right. Her mind tracked movement before it unfolded. A team leader down the slope was directing fighters into a new assault line. As he lifted his hand to signal their push, she sent another round. It struck cleanly, dropping him mid-gesture. His men spun in confusion, turning half circles as they tried to locate the ghost hitting them. She found the machine gun crew next. Two silhouettes feeding belt into a weapon meant to chew through anything in its path. She waited for the loader to lean forward, for that split-second pause and sway, then fired. The gunner collapsed instantly, the loader tipping backward with him, momentum cut. The heavy weapon sagged silent, its muzzle drooping uselessly toward the dirt. In under 20 seconds, the valley had changed shape. Where certain death had loomed, cracks of possibility began to open. The men below adjusted instinctively. Not bold, not celebrating, but shifting into a posture that suggested they sensed a chance. Heads lifted, searching upward, though none could see her blended into the ridge. Her radio hissed faintly, static thinning enough for words to break through. Major Aaron Vance's voice sounded nothing like earlier, smaller, hoarse, as if speaking to fate instead of command. "Whoever is firing, keep going." Another voice followed, strained but controlled. "She's shifting the whole fight. Whoever that is, hold your ground, do not move, do not break." Below, men crouched behind cover, listening as though the sky itself had spoken. Lena didn't answer, not even a click. Silence had always been her shape, long before a rifle ever defined it. The valley didn't need her voice. It needed accuracy. She reloaded with a calm breath and returned to work, clearing targets one deliberate shot at a time. Movement changed on the slopes beneath her. Patterns unraveling, positions that once stood firm now breaking apart. The enemy understood someone above was dismantling their design piece by piece, and they couldn't allow it. She caught flashes of shapes moving upslope, disciplined, controlled, advancing in staggered bounds rather than panicked rushes. They were coming for the ridge, coming for her. Lena slid from her firing position, crawling along the crest to avoid silhouetting herself against the dim sky. She shifted angles repeatedly, opening new sight lines from 3 separate low points, altering her firing rhythm so anyone watching for muzzle flash would misjudge her position. Crawling on her elbows tore what remained of her gloves, fabric shredding as dust ground into the frayed edges. Dust worked its way into the cuts along her knuckles, but she pushed the sting aside. Below her, chaos churned through the valley. What had once resembled a coordinated assault now unraveled into a frantic scramble. Men darted without direction. Someone barked orders that contradicted the last. Another fired wildly into darkness. A ridge that moments ago held advantage now pulsed with panic, and two enemy climbers had nearly reached her height. The first appeared abruptly, no more than 12 meters away, boots skidding on loose gravel. He turned into her shadow just as he raised his rifle. Lena rolled to her side, drew her sidearm and put 3 rounds into his chest before he could steady his aim. His body collapsed instantly and slid back down the slope. Before she regained a full breath, a second fighter emerged from another angle. Rounds sparked against the stone by her shoulder, dust exploding from each impact. She tucked herself behind a broken slab, pressing tight to the incline. Through a narrow gap barely wider than her thumb, she aligned her sights and fired 2 quick shots. He slumped forward, his weapon dropping first, followed by his body rolling until gravity carried him out of view. The ridge belonged to her again. She slid back to her rifle, heart hammering, not from fear but from urgency. Below, the enemy's final organized push was forming again, like someone desperately trying to prop up a collapsing tent. One figure stood out, shouting commands, signaling, trying to will structure back into a fight already disintegrating. She studied him through her scope, breath barely moving, watching a pattern she recognized. 15 seconds. He would lift his head, hold still to evaluate, then bellow a new direction. The valley's outcome hinged on those pauses. If he stayed alive, cohesion might snap back into place. If he fell, the whole force would crumble. A sharp, unpredictable gust swept across her line from the right, not steady enough to calculate cleanly. The shot forming was borderline impossible. Long distance, downward angle, unstable wind, and a body aching from the climb, the recoil, the relentless fight against gravity. Still, she calculated. She adjusted left, she held high, she waited 1 heartbeat, then another, and fired. No immediate sign, only the long, thin delay of distance carrying her answer. Then his body jerked back, knees folding as his voice died mid-command. Beneath him, the formation shattered without waiting for orders. Whatever structure remained dissolved into directionless motion. Certainty gave way to silence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It felt like a single string snapping, one quiet break that unravels everything tied to it. Down in the valley, the air shifted. Men who had been bracing for death suddenly sensed shape in the possibility of escape. A voice rose from someone crouched near the wounded, not triumphant, not shouting, but solid, steady, and real. "They're breaking," the man murmured. And then, soft at first, rotors began swelling through the night. UH-60s swept into the valley, their silhouettes dropping fast, firing arcs cutting across ridges that had been dead zones only minutes before. Door gunners tracked remaining movement while ropes spilled into the dust below. The SEALs pushed upward, not in panic now, but with the precision they thought they'd lost. The wounded went first. Those still able to fight covered slopes that had seemed unreachable at sunset. Major Aaron Vance was hauled on a stretcher, pain carved into his face, yet his eyes never left the ridgeline where she lay hidden. Men boarded in staggered waves, boots striking metal, rotors whipping the valley into a storm of sand and wind. The last man stepped onto the aircraft, paused, squinted back into the glare. "She's still up there," he whispered, not wondering, not asking, but admitting a truth he hadn't earned the right to voice. The helicopter banked away, and Lena remained, unlit, unseen, still guarding the ridge that had tried to take her life. Dawn had barely begun when the UH-60 returned for her. Its rotors pushed pale dust across the ridge in slow, swirling sheets. Lena rose from the spot where she'd waited through the dark, knees stiff, shoulders tight, hands wrapped in makeshift tape that hardly held the cuts together. She walked toward the aircraft without hurry, each step steady, leaving small prints in the frost-coated stone. When the ramp lowered, Major Vance stood braced in the doorway, his injured arm still strapped. His voice carried no authority now, only disbelief. "You were the ridge shooter." Lena offered no explanation, no shift in posture, no claim. She gave a single nod and stepped past him. Near the wall of the cabin, a younger SEAL, the same one whose laughter had echoed earlier, lowered his eyes when she approached. He said nothing. He offered no defense for everything he had assumed. He simply stepped aside, letting silence do the talking. She passed him without acknowledgement, and that quiet weighed heavier than any reprimand. Back at the forward base, Command dissected the battle, tracing every change in momentum back to a position they had believed unreachable. Regulations required a formal statement that under precise fire, executed from unstable elevation, 20-plus operators survived a situation that should have ended in catastrophic loss. They recommended a high valor commendation. The citation used stiff, emotionless language, calling her actions decisive under impossible terrain and limited ammunition. Lena read it once, folded it, and put it away. No celebration waited, just gear to clean, hands to rest, and new elevation lines to memorize. Some warriors make noise, some make shadows, but the ones who keep others breathing rarely need either. The ridge became her voice. The climb became her explanation. Courage isn't usually loud. Most of the time it climbs alone. And that night, 26 men walked out who should have come home beneath folded flags. Not because rank protected them, not because someone shouted loud enough on the radio, but because one quiet soldier refused to let silence mean defeat. Her climb went unseen, her shots unheard, her name unspoken until morning. Yet, when the valley emptied and the truth was counted, it was her presence above them, unnoticed, uncelebrated, that turned a night meant for loss into a dawn of survival. If this story moved you, subscribe to Major Tom's Tales so these acts of courage never fade, and tell us where in the world you're watching from today.